Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to the last day of palette week. Every single day for the last like 10 days. Well, not every single day because we did post my whole collection project pan update yesterday and then I did interrupt with a Sephora VIB sale recommendation. But we are on our 7th eyeshadow palette video for palette week. There are a few interruptions in there. But today I'm going to be sharing with you my March palette recap. So I'm going to be talking to you about every single eyeshadow palette that I used throughout the month of March. I also just filmed my April palette stash, so you can see which palettes I shot my stash for to pull out for April. But today we're going to be talking about a ton of data, statistics, numbers, how many times I used each eyeshadow palette, and because we are 3 months in to 2022, I'm also going to be doing a quarterly recap at the end of this video where I let you know how many palettes I've used out of my collection the last 3 months, give you a little bit of feedback there, a little bit of insight, a little bit more data and statistics. So if this sounds like your kind of video, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project panning content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I would love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. All right, you guys, before we get started with every single eyeshadow palette that I used in the month of April, how many times, etc., I do always like to start these videos with a little bit of a recap, compare this month to the other 2 months, kind of see how it compares, how many times, like how many eyeshadow palettes I used this month compared to like January and February. I have a graph to share with you guys. How exciting. And just as a baseline, I did do my makeup 17 times throughout the month of March. So in those 17 times that I did my makeup, I used a total of 36 eyeshadow palettes. I am someone who has sometimes like 8 eyeshadow palettes out at a time to create one look. And I just count a use as me reaching into that eyeshadow palette for at least one shade. So I used 36 of my eyeshadow palettes. I do currently have 161 palettes in my collection, so we got a lot of palettes to get through. This was my best month for total number of palettes used, which I'm really excited about. For total number used more than one time, meaning obviously I reached into a palette more than one time, I thought this would be an interesting baseline to compare because I'm reaching sometimes for like 8 palettes for one look. Like a lot of times I really only reached for a palette one time in a month, 3 months, etc. So it's like, even though the palette got used, like did it really get used? I just thought it was another fun thing to look at. So I used a total of 14 palettes this month, more than one time, which I am happy with. In February, February is my best month so far. I used 17 palettes more than one time. I will say I expected to do my makeup a little bit more than I did in March, but sometimes that little extra sleep was just worth it to me and I didn't go ham on my makeup. And then finally, before we get into the palettes that I used, I did hit 2 eyeshadow pans this month. This is my lowest month thus far for total eyeshadow pans hit, but I did hit pan on the shade Mea Culpa in the Nabla Secret palette. There it is right there. And super exciting, I do have an eyeshadow pan in my Huda Beauty Smoky Obsessions palette. I hit pan on this shade right here. This is one of my favorite palettes. So it's, even though it's like destroyed because I've dropped it so many times, it's good to see like it is getting love. There's like a legitimate pan out of use, not from like broken shadows in this. So those are the 2 palettes that I hit pan on this month. Now let's get into all of the eyeshadow palettes that I have reached for in the month of March. So I always like to go from least used to most used. So we're gonna start with the 17 eyeshadow palettes that I only reached for one time in March. Starting with one of the eyeshadow palettes that I hit pan on. I actually only reached for the Smoky Obsessions one time, specifically for this shade, and I wanna say also for one of these 2 shades, but this one was really close to pan. I wasn't expecting to hit pan the first time I reached into it, but it just so happened to be the day that I hit pan on it, so I was very excited about that. This is going on my palettes on their last 2 raw series, so kind of like a chopping block style of series on my channel. So I'm hoping to get more use out of that palette this year and maybe have a couple more pans. With the state of this palette being that so many of the shades are like broken, I'm a little bit nervous that if I hit pan in some of those shades, they'll break even more, so we'll see. Also the Patrick Ta Major Dimension palette. Yes, I reached for this one time. This has gotten used at least once every single month so far this year. I'm a huge fan of this eyeshadow palette and I was actually surprised to see that I only reached for that one time. Also, my BH Cosmetics 90s Remix Dance Palette I reached for. This was not pulled for my March Shop My Palette Stash series, but I wanted to create a look with this shade specifically, and I did like this lime green shade. I think when I did my April palette stash, I was sharing pictures of looks that I created. I think I thought I used a shade out of the Huda Python palette, but in reality it was actually this shade right here. I'll pop a picture of that look over here. It was kind of just like a fun, easy look to create because I really just went in with this shade and then the like matte chartreuse shade out of the Huda Python palette. But I anticipate I'll get some more use out of this palette in the spring, summer. And then I also reached for the Moonspell palette from Lunar Beauty one time. This I've owned in my collection for quite some time, but really have not reached for this much at all. So I wanted to at least show it love one day, and I reached for these two green shades just in honor of like St. Patty's Day for March. The Odenseye Norns palette, I just recently stated in my April palette stash video that I didn't reach for the Norns palette at all, but it turns out as I was grabbing all my palettes for this and looking at my notes, I did actually reach for this one time. I am still going to keep this pulled for April as well because I do think I'm so close to pan on Pink Chameleon. Would be nice to hit a pan there and add another eyeshadow pan to my collection. The Melt Smoke Sessions palette I reached for one time, and I pulled this palette again for the month of April in honor of 420. I felt like it was very fitting, and I actually had a suggestion from one of you guys to pull that palette for March as well. The Sigma Enchanted palette I reached for one time as well in March. This is a palette that I've used at least once every single month so far in 2022. I've just been really inspired by this palette. The Saga Freia palette, I thought I had reached for more than once, but perhaps I reached for it a couple times right at the end of February. I purchased this in February, yes, because I purchased this, I believe, the day of the Super Bowl. And I've reached for every single shade in this palette a couple of times. I actually really do enjoy this palette. I was a little bit disappointed in the shade Tears at first, but I've come to realize it's supposed to be like a lighter shade, and I really actually enjoy that. I have a pretty good dip going on it. It's more of like a cream to powder sort of shade, and I feel like this shadow formula is a little bit more powdery, so I already have like a decent disturbance in some of the matte shades, and I'm excited to continue to reach for this palette. I reached for both of my Lawless mini palettes that I own in my collection. One time I reached for the Baby One eyeshadow palette. Once I would like to come back to this and refocus on this palette. I feel like I could have some luck hitting pan on potentially all three of these shades this year, so that might end up being a goal down the road. And then I reached for the Glam One eyeshadow palette once in the month of March. This is going in my palettes in my Pan Those Eyeshadows series, and I'm working on this shade right here. I actually used this shade today another time, so trying to get some more use out of this. I actually really enjoy this palette, and I think I've reached for this palette at least once every single month in 2022 so far as well, so I do like using it. My Alter Ego Artemis palette I did reach for one time. I had pulled this for my March Shop My Stash, and I just wasn't feeling like, I don't want to say like overly inspired by this palette, but it's just such a large palette, and I was trying to use some other palettes on days that I was like really doing a whole production. Sometimes I feel like when I pull out larger palettes, like sometimes I feel like I shouldn't pull out a larger palette when I'm like going to work, because I feel like there's just too many options. So if I was filming, like if it was a day that I was like off and filming, I could see myself reaching for this, or that's like a day that I would reach for this. But I was also testing other palettes and just only ended up reaching for this one time. I do feel like that palette will get more love from me in the fall. My Pat McGrath Rose Decadence palette, I claim I only reached for this one time. I swear I reached for this more than one time. I swear I reached for this at least 4 times throughout the month of March. I was focused on this shade right here for my Pan Those Eyeshadows. I did decide to roll this out. I don't have pan yet, but I do have pan up here, and that to hit pan here took me a good amount of effort, and I feel like I just don't want to put that effort into this shade right now. I do really like this shade and actually really like this palette. I just am not feeling super inspired by this palette right now. I want to reach for other things, so I was ready to put this one away. My ColourPop Capricorn Quad, I believe I reached for this for an inner corner highlight. And I will continue to reach for this one quite frequently. I love these little ColourPop quads. Also, the Natasha Denona 5-Pan Biba palette is a really, really good one. I reached for this one time. I've reached for this well, I purchased this in February, so I guess I haven't reached for it every single month so far in 2022. The Sigma Untamed palette I also reached for one time. I anticipate I'll pull this one back out in the fall. I've been like loving my Sigma Enchanted, as I said, and just not as inspired by the Untamed. And then I'm super excited to pull out my Sigma Corderosa palette for the summer. The Marc Jacobs Electric palette I reached for one time. I reached for this a ton in February and hit pan on this shade, but I did end up reaching for this one additional time in March. I still have yet to create a look with this like silvery blue shade, like I said I wanted to do before putting this away. So you will probably see this one again in April. I feel like that shade is like perfect for like an April showers sort of look. You know what I mean? The Pat McGrath Eternal Eden Quad. I wanted to reach for this one more time to confirm my feelings that I wanted to declutter this, and I have confirmed I don't care to keep this in my collection, so you'll see that in an upcoming palette declutter. I also reached for the ColourPop The Child palette or the Mandalorian palette one time. I kind of wish I had reached for this more than one time. I kind of want to create just like a neutral look and put the Force in like all over my lid, so I'm sure I'll get some more use out of this later this year. Urban Decay Stone Vibes. I had pulled this in my March palette stash, and I anticipated I was going to get a ton of use out of this, and then I only reached for it one time, and I reached for the shade Meditate, which I'm so close, I feel like, to hitting pan right here. But because these are kind of like cream to powder shadows, they really only work with your finger, so it's like very awkward to try and hit pan, like very awkward to still try and focus my finger like way up where the dip is. So maybe I'm not that close. I also wish I had encouraged myself to reach for this a few more times, so this is another one I could see myself pulling back out potentially in May just to get some more use out of this one, because I do really like that palette. My Aether Beauty Rose Quartz Quad I reached for one time. I love these little Aether Beauty quads. They're super convenient just for like really quick looks. Also my Huda Nude Medium palette I reached for once. I swear I reached for this more than once, but I had set this on my desk to reach for it a little bit more in April as well. I didn't pull this into my April palette stash, but it's like another palette I'm kind of like sliding in to try and get some use out of. I just feel like I, with a little bit of effort, could hit pan on this center shade, so I'm like unofficially trying to pan that shade. And then the last two palettes that I reached for one time in March, the Natasha Denona Mini Gold. No, what is going on with like, seriously, I just feel like I just keep dropping / palettes keep breaking on me, although this pan just straight up fell out, but we're all good. The Natasha Denona Mini Gold, I believe I created a look using these two, like I created a neutral look and then reached for these two shades. This is another one I'd like to come back to. It's not my favorite mini palette, but I do still enjoy it. And then also the Natasha Denona Mini Glam palette. I do want to reach for this shade and try and hit pan on this as an inner corner highlight. It's one that I do plan to pan at some point this year, kind of like an unofficial try to pan that, but I did reach for both of these one time as well. All right, you guys, I just have two eyeshadow palettes that I reached for twice in the month of March. My ABH Jackie, I swear I reached for this like at least 5 times. That's why I'm like, am I tracking it correctly or am I forgetting? And that's why like I like to track, because sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I use that palette so often, and then I look at how many times I actually use it and I don't use it that much. But I could swear to you I use this at least 5 times. But I'm going with my tracked number of 2. I do want to focus on this palette this year. I would love, love, love to hit pan on Zam, Edges, and Ginger for sure this year, potentially even sponsored. Like if I could get 5 to 6 eyeshadow pans, like if I could have pan on half of this palette by the end of 2022, I would be so proud. This is one of my favorite palettes in my collection, but for some reason I don't reach for it because I feel like I need to reserve it for special occasions, and I just really don't want to do that this year. So this is something that I want to just keep top of mind. It's not in my palettes on their last 2 Raw series because I would not even consider decluttering this, but I do kind of want to make this a focus palette of 2022. And then also I reached for my Pat McGrath Sublime, Mothership Sublime palette twice. I thought I reached for this like at least 3 times, but maybe not. I have fallen in love with this shade. I really like this quad of shades, but this on the eyes is just so intense. It's like a pink with a gold flip. I don't know if it'll catch it on camera. Like, holy smokes. Let's see. What do people do like this? I don't know if you're gonna, hold on, probably not. Can we catch it? I don't know, but it is the most intense, wet, foiled, beautiful thing ever. Because like I'm looking at it right now and it looks like this like gold, like yellow gold with like a hint of green, and then I flip it like this and it's like a pink, it's like a wet pinky goldy green. It's so pretty. I love that shade. I'm gonna be reaching for that palette so much more. My Pat McGrath palettes, this is what I found with them. I feel like I purchased them, they're in my collection for like a year, and I use them like a little bit but not a lot, and then like all of a sudden I pull it out and fall in love with it. Like I feel like for like a year I regret my expensive palette purchase, and then like a year later I'm like in love with the palette. I'm like, how have I lived without you? That's what happened with my Bronze Seduction palette. I was like, like I like this, but I don't feel like it's necessarily worth the money, and now I'm like obsessed with my Bronze Seduction, and that's like slowly happening with this palette because I'm just like obsessed with this shade. Even like that one shade, I wouldn't spend $125 just for the one shade, but like there's other good shades in the palette too. All right guys, next up I have my palettes. I have 3 palettes. Ironic, I had 2 palettes with 2 uses and I have 3 palettes with 3 uses. So these are my 3 use palettes. Up first I have my Natasha Denona Lila palette. This was going in my Palettes on My Last Hurrah. This was going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, and still I only reached for this 3 times, so I'm a little bit disappointed in that. I was mostly focused on this shade, but because this is in my Palettes on Their Last Hurrah, I will continue to focus on this palette, specifically like this bottom row and some of the other metallics and shimmers, but I'm a little bit disappointed I only reached for this 3 times. This is one though I do believe I have reached for at least 1 time every single month of 2022. And then I had pulled both of these palettes for my March palette stash, and I was thinking when I pulled them I would probably only use each one time, so I'm really excited to see the 3 uses on each. I really enjoyed and had so much fun with the Python palette. I created a neutral look with these 3 shades right here, and then I also used the shade right here in conjunction with that really lime green like metallic shade from the BH 90s Remix palette, and I loved that. And I believe the 3rd time I used this palette I again reached for this shade with some shades from the Jackie palette, but I really enjoy the Python palette. I think it's really nice. The Lush Life palette, I created a look I also really liked. I can't even remember, I'll post a picture of the look on the screen, but I know I used this in the inner corner and loved it. The Lush Life really kind of took me by surprise. I really like this palette. These 2 shades intimidate me, but everything else in the palette I absolutely love and really enjoy using. I would say maybe I don't reach for this one that often either, but like I'm obsessed with this like lime green shade, and I feel like you can make this work in like a neutral-ish way as well. So really enjoyed having that as well. All right, you guys, next up I have 2 palettes with 4 uses each. I have the Alter Ego Canyon palette, which is going on my I'm working on in my Pan Those Eyeshadow series. I am working on the shade Desert Sun right here. I do have a pan in this palette, and the pans in this are like rather shallow. I feel like this is something that I also reach for quite a bit in the summertime, just because it's like that like really nice like sultry bronze sort of color story, but I did reach for that 4 times. I also reached for the Pat McGrath Mothership Sublime Bronze Temptation palette 3 times, and this is one that you'll probably continue to see use on. I'm currently working on this shade right here. Just that's the shade I'm using as my brow powder. I always like, I'll work on a shade that's like a deep brown like this as a brow powder until I hit pan, and then I'll just cycle on to a different one in another palette. But I do like this palette because I love these 2 shades as well. They're really fun like duochrome shades. This is like a red to green to brown, and this is like a really beautiful like green gold shade. So I've been enjoying reaching for this. This is one that's also going on my Palettes on Their Last Hurrah, because I just have not reached for this due to like mostly the packaging, and it was also my first Pat McGrath palette, so I feel like there's a part of me that's like, you spent, like, it's Pat McGrath palette, it's known to be more expensive, so I do that thing where I feel like I can't use it. It's silly, it's dumb. I'm glad I'm starting to use it. I have just 1 palette that I reached for 5 times. It is my ABH Sultry. This is a palette that consistently year after year is one of my most reached for, most used palettes. And I had realized I hadn't reached for this really much at all so far this year. So I was like, I need to reach for my ABH Sultry. So I pulled this one back out. This one currently has 4 eyeshadow pans in it. I would love to also make this kind of like a unofficial focus palette of this year and maybe hit pan on 2 more shades. I feel like the easiest for me to hit pan on would maybe be like Birch and then like Rose Quartz, or potentially Cinder or Teak, depending on like what what I'm going for, I guess. I don't know. I'm not necessarily like super close to pan on any of them right now, but I would love to have at least half this palette with pan by the end of 2022. I have 2 eyeshadow palettes that I reached for 6 times each. Up first, I have my Huda Coral Obsessions. This is going in my pan those eyeshadows. I'm like, I have so many like palettes on the last hurrah, pan those eyeshadows, palette stash, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, what am I saying? But I reached for this shade right here, or reached into this palette 6 total times. I am focused on this shade right here, but I reached for this 6 times. I anticipate I'll reach for this at least 6 times this month, and I'm hoping to have a second pan in this. When this got rolled into my pan those eyeshadows, I was like, I wish this had gotten rolled in maybe more towards the summertime. But just today, I actually used this just like to kind of blend everything together. And I was like, dang, I kind of want to like really focus on this and hit quite a few pans in this as well. I just was really enjoying or like feeling inspired by this. So reached for that 6 times. I also reached for my Nabla Secret palette 6 times. This is another one of the palettes that I hit a pan on. This was my brow powder shade. I'm now hit pan on it, so I clearly am working on a different brow powder, but this is also a palette going on my palettes on their last hurrah, and I want to continue to reach for this throughout 2022. This is another one that I've reached for every single month so far this year. All right, and I have 2 more palettes to round it out with. Up first, we have my ColourPop, another ColourPop quad. This is the Pisces in the Sky quad, another palette I was working on in the Pan Those Eyeshadows series. Specifically, I was working on this shade right here. There is like a disturbance here, but I reached for this 8 times this past month for a total of 16 times, and I just felt like I was nowhere near pan, so I did end up rolling this out. But I do anticipate I'll continue to reach for this palette this year, so I think this will get a lot of love. So reach for this one 8 times, and then, you guys, let me just count. Okay, my ColourPop Low Ray of Sunshine. I reached for this 13 times in the month of March. We're gonna get into it, but I believe I've reached for this 36 total times this year. Every single time I reach into this palette, I reach for this shade right here as a like lid setting shade. I was working on this shade right here in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, but I rolled this out because I was like, don't feel like working on it. But I've continued to work on this shade, thinking I would hit pan in like 20 uses. It's ColourPop, it's not Too Faced, it's not Tarte. I was like, oh, for sure I'll have pan by 20 uses. And we're 36 uses in, and I've used it a couple more times now that we're into April that like aren't being counted towards this, and still we don't have a pan. And I'm very perplexed and very shocked, and every day I think I'm gonna hit pan and I just keep not hitting pan. So I'm gonna keep working on this palette until I hit pan. But yeah, 13 more uses throughout the month of March and still no pan. All right guys, so that is my update for all of the palettes that I used throughout the month of March. Now, like I said in the introduction, I'm gonna give you a little bit of like a quarterly recap now that we're 3 months into 2022. So I was kind of surprised when I was going through this. This was my worst quarter in the years that I've been tracking, which I believe I've been tracking now for over 2 years, but this was my worst quarter in terms of like total palettes used in the first quarter. So I'm always really close to like 70 or so palettes used in a given month, 70 or more. I only used 62 of my 161 eyeshadow palettes the first 3 months of the year, putting me at 38.5% of my palette collection used and 99 palettes unused, or 61.5% of my eyeshadow palette collection is currently going unused. Now, I do have some palettes that are still counted towards that 161 that I have set aside that I know I'll declutter when I do a palette declutter, but still. And then I also like to break things down by like palettes that got 1 to 4 uses, 5 to 10 uses, 11 to 19 uses, and 20 plus uses. And I only have 11 palettes that I've used 5 or more times, which is like pretty equal to like what I have been at. So I'm going to quickly share with you my 11 top most used palettes of 2022 thus far. Starting with the 7 palettes that I've used anywhere from 5 to 9 times, I will start with the Lila palette, which I have reached for 5 times. As I already mentioned, this is a palette going on my palettes on their last Hoorah series, so I would like to see this at least, at the bare minimum, 30 uses this year, and I'm only at 5 uses, but 5 is better than none. 5 is better than none. We don't want to be too hard on ourselves, right? Also, my Pat McGrath Rose Decadence palette, I have reached 4 or 5 times. Again, I feel like I've reached for this more than 5 times. This is something I do think I will come back to, maybe in like July, just to reach for like a super fiery bronze shade, but I'm currently just at 5 uses on that for the year. My ABH Sultry palette also has 5 uses for the year. As I already mentioned, this is something that consistently is one of my most used palettes every single year, so I anticipate this will get a lot more use in the months to follow. I have 2 palettes that are at 6 uses for the year. We have the Lawless, the Glam 1 palette, and this is currently still going in my Pan Those Eyeshadow series, so this will definitely get some more use, as well as my Huda Coral Obsessions palette has 6 uses and is currently going on my Pan Those Eyeshadows series. At 7 total uses, I have the Natasha Denona Mini Love eyeshadow palette, and I do have a pan in here that I hit this year. This was an inner corner highlight that I was working on, and I do love this as an inner corner highlight, but I have hit pan on this, so I don't necessarily see myself coming back to this one as aggressively as I have in the past, but I do also really like this shade. I don't know when I'll be reaching for like this shade of like purple pink, but hopefully this at least breaks like the 15 to 20 threshold this year. And then my Alter Ego Canyon palette, I have reached for 9 total times so far this year. This is still going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows series, so this one will definitely be getting more use in 2022. Next up, I have 3 palettes that I used anywhere from 10 to 19 times, and all 3 have been in my Palettes on the Last Hurrah and Pan Those Eyeshadows series. So up first we have the Nabla Secret palette. I reached for this 12 total times this year. I do have a pan in this one. It's going in my Palettes on Their Last Hurrah. I anticipate this will have hopefully at least, again, 20 to 30 uses. The Marc Jacobs Electric palette, I have reached for 14 total times this year. I do have a new pan in this palette as well. Again, this is going on my Palettes on Their Last Hurrah. I'm hoping to at least break 20 uses with both of these by the end of the year, but hopefully bare minimum 30. And then my ColourPop Pisces in the Sky palette is not in my Palettes on the Last Hurrah, but this is in my, or was in my Pan Those Eyeshadows. I reached for this one 16 total times, and I anticipate I will reach for this at least another 10 times this year, putting me over 25 uses. Again, only time will tell, but that is where we're at with these 3. And then the one and only palette that's been used over 20 times, my most used palette so far of 2022, is my ColourPop Little Ray of Sunshine. Little Ray of Sunshine right here. Is it so sunny? Because I'm a little bit annoyed that I haven't hit pan in this yet. But this, who knows how many uses it'll be till I hit pan, and I'm not putting this down till I hit pan, and I will also pull this out next fall. So maybe, perhaps, this will be a palette that gets over 50 uses from me in 2022. Again, only time will tell, but it only needs another 14 uses to hit 50. So I could definitely see this one getting 50 uses, and I don't think I've had any palettes over 50 uses in the past. I'd have to go back and fact check and make sure that that's accurate information. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty confident that I'm giving you an accurate answer there. I feel like next use I'm gonna hit pan, but I also really want to get to 50 uses on this palette this year. So this is my most used palette. Those are my top 11 most used palettes so far in 2022. I would love to know, what is your most reached for palette in 2022? What palettes are you neglecting this year? Leave me comments, let me know. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video, for supporting my channel, for supporting Palette Week. Leave me your comments down below on other palette themed content you would like to see. I know I've gotten a couple of suggestions already, so there will definitely be more palette content sprinkled in throughout the coming weeks. But I just appreciate you guys supporting me and supporting my channel and supporting Palette Week. Thank you so much. I'll catch you in tomorrow's video. Bye.